Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to Anatomy of a Murder Mystery. I'm Alan Russell. I'll be your moderator tonight. It wasn't that long ago that academia and the literati looked upon crime fiction as a lowbrow form of entertainment. More than half a century ago, Edmund Wilson wrote an essay for the New Yorker titled, "Who Cares Who Killed Roger Ackroyd?" Apparently many people here do care who killed Roger Ackroyd. I'd like to thank UCSD Extension for recognizing the need for this program and Tanya Meyer for organizing it. Crime fiction is producing some of the best writing in all of literature these days, and it's gratifying that many universities are beginning to recognize that. In the first part of tonight's program, I'll spotlight each of the authors individually, asking them specific questions about their writing, as well as delving into their biographies. I promised to not do a Barbara Walters type interview with them, where her intended purpose seems to be to get all of her interviewees to cry. But just in case, I do have a box of tissues for everyone. The second part of the program will be a round robin, and I'm going to throw out questions to the group as a whole, and I expect the exchange will be lively. I doubt whether the box of tissues will be needed for that, but we do have a first aid kit in case it gets a little too lively. I know all the authors are looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Everything is fair game to ask except the following question. Where do you get your ideas? I think most people in the audience know that authors buy their ideas through it's a company in Topeka, Kansas. It's called Novel Ideas. Also on the forbidden list is this proposal. I have this great idea for a novel. Why don't you write it and we'll split the money? The reason I know you can't make that proposal is because I made this very same proposal earlier to all of them, and unbelievably they weren't interested. Now I'd like to introduce the authors and tell you a little bit about them. This will be the authorized biography part. Once we're done that, we'll get to the Kitty Kelly version. Let me get this in order. I might as well start with Abby. Abigail Padgett grew up in America's heartland in Vincennes, Indiana, and I don't think the Hoosier State will ever be the same. As far as I know, Abby was never interested in basketball, which is a violation of the state religion, my own as well. Abby got her undergraduate degree in English at Indiana University. Like most overeducated mystery writers, one degree was not enough for Abby. Over time, she earned a master's degree in counseling from the University of Missouri and an ABD in sociology from Washington University. In between getting all her degrees, Abby worked as a school teacher. As hard as it might be to imagine now, Abby was teaching in Missouri when she was forced to leave her position after becoming pregnant. Now, we're not talking the Scopes monkey trial here. This wasn't that long ago. And Abby knew that that law was very wrong and needed to be changed. Her experience prompted her to take a position at an alternate high school for pregnant teen women. And these pregnant teens were funneled into a turn-of-the-century primary school building that more resembled a house of horrors than a place of education. Abby remembers one hot September afternoon watching one of her near-term students struggle to get a drink out of one of the child-sized water fountains. Unable to drink standing up, she had to lower her knees onto the ground littered with rat droppings. Abby had her epiphany. She says at that moment she became a feminist. She was one of the original members of the St. Louis chapter of the National Organization of Women. In addition to working on behalf of feminism, Abby also became an advocate for the mentally ill. Her investment of time and energy has been both personal and philosophical. A family member has a psychiatric disorder. Abby saw how much misinformation was being circulated about the mentally ill. The portrayals of such individuals in print, television, and film are generally not only unflattering, but wrong. Abby has never been afraid of putting on her armor and taking on the windmills. When Thomas Harris wrote his book, Silence of the Lambs, Abby took particular umbrage of the passage where he described a schizophrenic as having a telltale goat-like smell, usually associated with schizophrenia. Abby wrote Harris a letter saying that the mentally ill do not have an odor that differentiates them from others. She also went on to say that she intended to write a book with the good guy having a psychiatric disorder, not the villain. And Abby did as she said. Bo Bradley was born in her debut book, Child of Silence. Bo is unique. She has bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression. Bo was featured in 5 novels as an investigator for Child Protective Services. She was not only a champion for the children that she protected, but a champion with mental illness. Her latest novel is Blue. More on that and Abby later. I like bios. I hope you do too. I'm going to tell you about Don Winslow now. I don't think Don Winslow is ever going to run short of story ideas. All he has to do is tap into his own life experiences. He was born in New York City on Halloween night. Happy birthday. His father was career military. As for Don's schooling, he was quoted as saying, "I don't think he ever really recovered from a Catholic school education." He attended the University of Nebraska. During his junior year, he went to South Africa, and his day job was as a researcher at the University of Cape Town. During his junior year, he went to South Africa, and he had a day job doing freelance newspaper work for the University of Cape Town. But his unpaid job was smuggling money in to help build classrooms in Soweto. The then apartheid government did not look favorably upon his activities, and they arrested Don and told him to leave the country. Back in the States, Don directed the Historical Theater Company for several years. This was a Midwestern vaudeville troupe. He proved that he really could act by bluffing out his credentials and making people think he knew what he was doing. Don then did what every writer dreams of doing. He moved to an isolated cabin. Maybe not that they don't dream of moving to the cabin beyond Hope, Idaho. That's where he was. But there he herded cattle and he did fence riding. But it wasn't quite Louis L'Amour because he also delivered salad dressing to towns in Montana and eastern Washington. After Don got tired of ranching and ranch dressing, he moved to New York City and spent several years managing movie theaters. His Catholic education must have kicked in there because he submitted figures showing that management had its fingers deep in the popcorn butter. For Don's good deed, he got fired. However, his rectitude was later rewarded when he was hired to go undercover and report on organized theft in movie theaters. The detective work appealed to Don and led to other jobs. Don's assignments have taken him to such places as London and Amsterdam, and he still has a couple of toes in the pool now, he tells me. Don also worked for the Institute for International Studies, where, among other things, he posed as a terrorist to teach his students how to react to such threats. When Don got tired of terrorizing diplomats for a living, he went back to school and got his master's in military history. His plan was to go into foreign service, but instead he joined a safari team and spent the next 5 years leading safaris in Kenya and China. During that time, Don got married and had a son. When he returned to the United States, he worked as an analyst doing work with witnesses in arson and fraud trials. Somewhere between all these life experiences, Don was also managing to write. His first novel, Cool Breeze in the Underground, was published in 1990 and nominated for an Edgar Award. The series, which continued on for 5 books, features a reluctant private investigator named Neil Carey. Those books received nice critical notices, but Don stayed below the radar screen. There's something called the mid-list. Authors know it only too well, some of the authors here. And we won't describe that undescribed, the circle of hell that Dante did, but Don knows it well. But he emerged from it. When Don and I talk, we'll learn how he escaped that underground through his breakout book, The Death and Life of Bobby Z, and more recently, California Fire and Life. Jan Burk was born in Houston, Texas.
And has lived a very dull life.
You won't hear a Texas twang out of her because most of her life she lived in Southern California. She went to Cal State Long Beach and got her degree in history. She also did graduate work there and was a member of the Rockefeller Foundation National Endowment for the Humanities Grant Team, which conducted oral histories with Rosie the Riveters. You think someday they're going to they're going to have a team interviewing us and we could talk about life before computers and, whiteout and all those kind of things, I used to work on something called a typewriter, After college, Jan managed a manufacturing plant. It was her night job, though, that she found more interesting. After putting in long days, she put in even longer nights writing. Her first novel, Good Night, Irene, did the impossible. It was submitted unagented and unsolicited. This means it ended up in what's referred to in publishing as the slush pile. These days, most publishers don't even have slush piles. If the book isn't submitted by an agent, most publishers won't read it. But even when publishers did have slush piles, success stories were about as rare as lottery winners. In this case, though, cream did rise to the top, and we're not talking a minor publisher. Goodnight Irene was published by Simon & Schuster. The story doesn't end there, though. In President Clinton's first televised White House interview, the topic turned to his reading. And what book do you think President Clinton held aloft for the cameras and national audience? Good night, Irene, and traveled all the way from the slush pile to the enthusiastic hand of the leader of the free world. Who says there are no more Cinderella stories? Jan's protagonist is Irene Kelly, a newspaper reporter for the Los Pianos Express, Los Pianos being an amalgam of coastal Southern California. Jan takes her research very seriously. Though she writes about a newspaper reporter, she wasn't a journalist herself. After the fact, though, she became a Sunday columnist for the Long Beach Press-Telegram. She still occasionally writes columns for them. Recently, she was doing research on running for her book, Bones. She took her research a step further than most and decided to train for a marathon. Her labors were rewarded when she completed the 26.2-mile course of the Dublin, Ireland Marathon. Jan's latest book is Bones, the seventh in the Irene Kelly series. While most series books seem to lose their inertia along the way, Jan is a living testament that it doesn't have to be that way. This year, Bones won the Edgar, which is Mystery's Oscar for Best Crime Novel. More on Jan and her writing shortly. Michael Connelly's at the end down there. You still awake, Michael? He was born in Philadelphia, and unlike W.C. Fields, he decided that, all things considered, he'd rather not be in Philadelphia. Michael's the second of 6 children. The Connelly family moved to Florida in 1968, and Mike ended up graduating from the University of Florida, proof that that school can produce something besides good football teams. Initially, he was a building construction major, but he ended up majoring in journalism. After graduating, Mike worked on newspapers in Daytona Beach and Fort Lauderdale. His specialty was the crime beat, and the work kept him busy because he was reporting during the height of the murder and violence wave that hit South Florida during the so-called cocaine wars. Michael took a job as a crime reporter with the Los Angeles Times in 1987. After 3 years on the beat, he began writing his first novel featuring Los Angeles police detective Hieronymus Bosch. That novel, published in 1992, garnered him the Edgar Award for Best First Novel. It was just a taste of things to come. Since that time, Michael has won virtually every award in crime fiction. His novels have been published in umpteen languages, and he's a regular on bestseller list. His books have been optioned for the big screen by such stars as Clint Eastwood. For the last 18 months, Michael's been working on a television program that he created. He might not want to talk about this as much, but we'll still talk about it. Last week saw the network debut of his vision, a show called Level 9. And Michael just finished his 10th book. Among his fans are President Bill Clinton, who asked to meet the author during one of his visits to Los Angeles. Michael got to welcome him to LA as he disembarked from Air Force One. Of his 9 published books, 6 have featured Harry Bosch and 3 have been standalone works. His dead-on portrayal of LA and his skilled writing have led many to call him the heir to Raymond Chandler. I find it interesting that Chandler was born in the Midwest and grew up in England, and that Michael's roots are on the East Coast, and yet both are known for chronicling the City of Angels. Michael is married and the proud father of a little girl. Last week, Michael was featured at a Men of Mystery luncheon. He had control of the microphone then and used it to single me out several times. Payback for Michael will occur shortly. Now I'm going to talk to the authors a little bit one-on-one, some questions. It's hard to believe that there was a time when I was San Diego's only active mystery writer. And luckily, I didn't remain the only show in town for long. Other crime writers emerged in the scene. I remember meeting Abigail Padgett for the first time at her debut San Diego book signing. And I waited my turn in line, and then I came up to her and I said, "Hi, I'm Alan Russell." And she looked at me with an unsmiling face and a gimlet eye, and she said, "I know who you are." She didn't say, "Oh, how nice to meet you," or "Your reputation precedes you." She didn't say, "Oh, I read your books," or better, "I just love your books." She said, "I know who you are." It sort of felt like Judgment Day, and that my many sins were known. I came to know Abby much better after that fierce first impression. One of the reasons I like her so much is that she's a very passionate person and isn't content to sit back in the face of perceived injustices. The volcano that burned inside Abby showed itself in her first novel. She was compelled to write that book. In January, she'll be teaching a mystery writing class for UCSD Extension, and I'm sure she's going to advise all the unpublished writers not to quit their day jobs, and yet that's just what she did. With very little in the way of safety net under her, she finished Child of Silence, and then had no idea about how to go about getting it published. The cart is often in front of Abby's horse, but she still finds a way to get to that finish line. I remember talking with Abby another time, and she was telling me about this awful villain in her book. She said she was so upset with what he had done, she had to go to the bathroom and throw up. Are writers serious about what they write? I know that Abby sure is. On one occasion, Abby and I had a book coming out the same month, so we ended up doing some book signings together, and she decided to take a bus up to LA with the plan that I would give her a ride home. Well, I never did give her a ride because Abby ended up driving up herself, but not alone. Her passenger was a sailor who got bumped off the bus. Abby said that the bus company was essentially preying on the weak and the helpless, and they could act with impunity because few of their passengers were going to challenge whatever they did. Well, Abby was going to take on that bus company, but the first thing she did was give that sailor a ride. I'm glad I wasn't that bus company executive on the receiving end of Abby's call. I'm willing to bet she probably said, "I know who you are." Over the years, I've come to know that Abby is a softie at heart. She agonizes over doing the right thing, but it's not the easy thing sometimes. I won't say anything else that's too sentimental because Abby will probably throw up over that more readily than she would her villain. But talk a little bit about her books now. Your character, Bo Bradley, a lot of times they say characters are groundbreaking, but I really think she was groundbreaking. I was interested that when Bo was in a manic stage, your prose got hurried and fast, and it was like the reader was getting propelled that way too. It was fast and staccato. What was your feedback from readers with bipolar disorder about Bo?
Well, actually, it was really quite interesting. I thought when I started writing the Bo Bradley series that this, I was just pulling this out of thin air because I wanted to do this thing, I wanted to show a sleuth character for once who has the psychiatric disorder, not the crazed villain lurking with the chainsaw in the shrubbery. As we know, everyone with a psychiatric disorder comes automatically with a chainsaw. But I didn't have any idea until I started getting the mail. Here we have a child abuse investigator, which is a rough and stressful job, and I did do this work here in San Diego for the San Diego County Department of Social Services for a couple of years, and so I knew what I was talking about, and I also know about the stress. Hated that job. Anyway, that's what Bo Bradley does. But I started getting letters. First one was from Florida, and it was from a woman who said, I can't even sign my name, but I am working as a child abuse investigator and I have bipolar disorder. And then I got one from Michigan. And I got another one from someplace else. And over the years, I would say I get maybe 2 or 3 of these letters a year from the real Bo Bradleys that are working in the very job. Not even an ancillary and similar job, but the real thing. And every single one of these folks says, how do you know what it's like to be manic? Well, I don't have manic depressive disorder, but my son does. And believe me, I have sat around many a locked ward and better circumstances, and the symptoms are not exactly strange to me. I actually used some of the things that he had experienced in one of the books, in 2 of them, the first one and the second one, Child of Silence and Straw Girl. So, that speeded up awareness and the strange and peculiar attachments that people make who are in a manic state to things, like furniture starts to have meaning and that sort of thing. That's where I learned it, and I have heard, Alan, from countless at this point people who are living with this disorder and similar disorders that I got it right anyway.
Good. Donald Westlake's wife once said that his mood was very different when he was writing dark novels as opposed to writing light novels. Did you find your mood changing with Bo's psychological state? Were you running around, or was it just sitting there at your computer and...
Oh, Alan, you just sit there.
I keep hoping someone will tell me you do other things besides that, but yeah.
We all know that the hideous truth is that you just sit there, and if you don't sit there, if the chair is cold, the book doesn't get written. It's just the way it is. I wish I could say something interesting, but the truth about work is that it's work.
Now, when you were working with Child Protective Services, was that one of the bad jobs of your life, or did you?
Wretched, vile, hated it, as I said. It was extremely difficult to do that, and Bo Bradley was my way of getting back at the system, because as far as I'm concerned...
We are being televised here, so...
oh, that's right. Oh, yes. I forgot. I'm a nice lady. The system itself is probably as damaging as the abuse that it's designed to protect children from. And I'm not afraid to say that on television.
Okay. Saul Stein, in his book Stein on Writing, wrote, "Thou shalt imbue thy heroes with faults and thy villains with charm, for it is the faults of the hero that bring forth his life, just as the charm of the villain is the honey with which he lures the innocent." Bo's bipolar disorder made her very sympathetic. Blue McCarran is very different. After writing so many books with Bo, was it hard drawing this new character?
No, Blue just came to me out of the blue. Blue is a fantasy of mine. Blue lives out in the desert. She lives in Borrego Springs. In fact, she lives on what is actually parkland out there. And I used to, when I first moved to San Diego, I used to camp out there by myself, and occasionally still do that. I find it terrifying and neat to do that. It's really, really scary out there when you're by yourself. And in the old days, the bottle of wine that went with me helped a lot too. Anyway, Blue is just a fantasy. She lives alone in a motel that never got finished because they couldn't get piped in water, and so the developer gave up on it, and so she could buy it, as I said in the book, for as much as a Donna Karan outfit. She gets an entire 12-room motel with a swimming pool, and she lives out there with her dog Bronte, who is a Adobe, and solves crimes. And in the first Blue, there will only be two Blues. I think of them as Blue 1 and Blue 2. The first one is called Blue, and the second one is called The Last Blue Plate Special, in which I did more research on blue willow plates than I thought was possible, and tried to cram it all into the book, because it's so interesting, although it has very little to do with the plot.
That seems to be a motif of yours. Do a lot of research that doesn't ultimately get in the plot. Is this absolutely necessary, you think? I remember one time you were talking to me about Rambly Earth, and you were talking like a zealot, that you read books, you called architects, you did everything. And then I said, well, was this essential to your plot? Well, it took about a paragraph, and you spent about 3 weeks. Is this typical of your process? Do you think that's necessary for you?
I don't think it's necessary, and I'm certain that everyone else on the panel will say it isn't necessary at all. However, it's the fun part. The Rammed Earth dwelling frenzy period, Alan and I happened to be doing a signing or something. I couldn't talk about anything else. I wanted to build, in fact, I tried to build, get this, a Rammed Earth doghouse. I was going to build one in my own backyard, but the dirt isn't right. You have to have a certain kind of clay, and I didn't have anything to ram it with. I mean, you have to really,
You see, it didn't go in her books, but she gets to talk about it now.
Yeah, I can talk about it now.
It still wants to come out. The Rammed Earth mystery.
Yeah.
Shauna Casey wrote, "When I stepped from hard manual work to writing, I just stepped from one kind of hard work to another. What's the hardest thing for you about your writing, and how do you defeat that nemesis?"
I wish I'd seen this question before.
They don't know any of these questions before they're given. So.
No, we are all impromptu here. The hardest, what was that again, Alan?
What's the hardest thing for you about writing, and how do you defeat that nemesis?
The nemesis, the juggernaut, the damning demon in the dark.
She doesn't know.
She's buying time with endless alliterative remarks. It probably just, stark terror, I'd say, Alan. When you're writing another book and you don't know how it's going to go, or how it's going to be received, or if it's even any good. I mean, we all go through, that moment when you think this is the worst piece of, garbage ever written, and of course it isn't, because you keep that book so you can go look at it when you have to and realize that it isn't that bad. There's great insecurity that goes with the writing life, because you're alone all the time. Of course, your friends are always going to say, yes, you're a good writer and you're brilliant and everything, but until The book is sold, and you get some nice reviews. It's hard to consistently believe this, particularly when you're in the depths of writing one. How one keeps going in this isolation remains a mystery to me, although I've now got 7 books out. Well, the 7th one comes out in March, working on an 8th. It's just something you do.
It is terrifying before you start a book. You say, oh no, here go 2 years of my life, and it's a tough first step. Yeah. Which of your novels was the most difficult to write, and why was it?
That would be Straw Girl. This is the one I told Alan I actually barfed over. This was my...
I used the word throw up, I believe.
Throwing up. He was more polite, and I keep forgetting this is being taped, and so I will say I became ill. This was my, regurgitating, literally, my rage from some of the experiences I had as a child abuse investigator at child molesters. Because in that job, it was necessary to be polite. You could never be critical. You could never, going to interview someone you know perfectly well has done this heinous thing, you still have to be polite and courteous because you're working for a bureaucracy, and bureaucrats are always polite. But what happens is that a lot of rage builds up and a lot of homicidal anger, and so this was the book in which I wanted to get rid of that, and did, in creating a character who is a child molester. And it was very difficult, and I'll never do that again. This, however, was very well received by the New York Times, who loved it. It's a very dark book, and that was very hard to write. And as I said, I've done it, and I won't have to do it again.
Last question. You've gone from Beau to Blue, from social services to social psychology. Does your next protagonist have a B in her name, and what does she do?
Actually, this is what is really intriguing. My next protagonist isn't a she. It's a he.
Does he have a B in his name?
He does not have a B in his name. His name is Finnegan. And actually, there are two protagonists in this one, and they're both men. Very different, very disparate personalities investigating what will turn out to be the same murder from totally different viewpoints. But this is a great departure. This one, however, is incredibly dark too. Not as dark as Straw Girl, but it's dark. So we'll see. We'll just see.
Maybe she'll just get nausea this time, we hope.
No, I don't think so.
Don Winslow is our next author I'm putting on the grill here. Unlike everyone else on this panel, I'd never met Don face-to-face until today, and yet having read his books, it's almost as if I do know him. Certain writers have a voice that resonates off the pages, and Don is one of those writers. I also know of Don through others. He has this life of the party reputation, and as I have to be somber and dignified tonight, I was hoping someone else could play the class clown. Don is one of the few people alive who actually claimed that he played vaudeville, because it's not that he's so old, he's not, but his time with the Historical Theater Company gave audiences a view to the past, and Don was called on to play the penny whistle and the juggle. So if this program lags, I've worked out a signal with Don where you can put his talents to use.
I used to play it through my nose, Alan. It's the sad part.
You don't understand there were people who played instruments in other areas. But
my child's here, so
okay.
people would drive 200-300 miles to see me play the tin whistle through my nose. It was a very empty area.
Well, any of you here tonight to see that?
Just hands, please.
Don's life changed with the publication of his novel, The Death and Life of Bobby Z. For years, he toiled in the relative anonymity, writing these well-received books, but they're the kind of books that you never could find in the 7-Eleven or places like that. And then he wrote this book that suddenly all the Hollywood studios were hot for, and that they ended up having a bidding frenzy to get. And the following week, publishers were just as enthusiastic. So it was suddenly, Don had, it was like he had won the lottery. But it wasn't a case of luck. He waited a lot of years to win that lottery. And people always tell me how different my books are, Don, and I think that can be said about you as well. Your Neil Carey books are very different than Death and Life of Bobby Z and California Fire and Life. Did you know you had those different voices in you?
Yeah. everything that used to get me in trouble in school, now they pay me to do. Different voices and being the class clown. So, yeah, I kind of did. But, I did 5 of the Neil Careys, and then it was kind of time to move on. I was really bored with myself. Other people were, too.
And you said, I'm going to write a high-octane book now.
No, my agent took me out to lunch at the same place where Dylan Thomas drank himself to death, which I think he was trying to tell me something, trying to maybe suggest an alternative. And he said, I want you to write this next book as a standalone, and I'll sell it to the movies before I sell it to a publisher. I said, Jimmy, that's nuts. But I, agreed to do it, but I was pouting about it, and I wrote Bobby Z actually on a train.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, it's going to be a writing...
Not in one trip, thank you, as some critics have suggested.
In fact, I was going to say that's a tip to writers. He took the hour and 20-minute San Juan Capistrano to LA train every day.
And that's there? How are you getting all this?
I have my ways.
Apparently, yeah.
And so any of you who are aspiring writers, that train might be your ticket because, the conductor would say to Don, next stop, whatever, and he'd realize he better finish up that chapter real quickly.
Right, yeah.
Now, have you thought about doing another book on that train just to,
Yeah, to do a faster book,
Right.
yeah.
It worked so well one time, you might as well...
I'm going to subway stops now, it's a short...
Really fast.
Yeah, exactly, 40-second, 50, bam, I'm there.
You think these high-octane books are your way of the future, or are you going to suddenly be reflective and talking about Tobias Smollett again or something? I read a Tobias Smollett book back in UCSD 25 years ago, and probably I hadn't seen that name since.
Does anybody here know who Tobias Smollett was?
Humphrey Clinker.
Humphrey Clinker and Roderick Random, 18th century British author of...
Don, I knew there was a reason I shouldn't have brought it up.
Right. You can come back from your naps now, it's all right. I'm glad to have given you this pause.
So you think you'll be...
I don't know. Right now I'm writing a long tome that's sort of a fictional history of drug trafficking in America. So it's sort of high octane in a different sense, but it's a little slower than Bobby Z. But I like writing fast, and I have the attention span of a gerbil, so it's a good thing.
We've all heard the advice, write what you know, even though most writers play fast and loose with that rule.
Yeah.
In California Fire and Life, your protagonist...
Do you have my mother behind there? It's amazing. You can't see behind what he has behind here. It's terrifying.
She wanted to remind you should be flossing more.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
But you actually did know what you were writing about, which was amazing, huh? That your protagonist, Jack Wade, is an insurance claims adjuster. In your own life, you spent 10 years investigating arson fires and other insurance fraud. And judging from what you wrote, a lot of people out there are committing insurance fraud. Tell us about some of your experiences as a real-life investigator that you can talk about.
Yeah, most of them I can't. There's a reason they call it private investigator, and they get upset with you if you stand in front of a microphone and say, cameras and, talk about people. This book, unfortunately, is pretty close to nonfiction, as close to a nonfiction book as I've written, and I did not have a good time writing that book. I think I have maybe a small understanding of what a soldier writing his memoirs of a losing war feels like, and so my editor kept pushing me to write this book and going into more detail, and I hated it. I've never read it, and I was glad when I finished it, but it's unfortunately too close to real life.
Right. I heard you and your son had fun, though. You were literally playing with fires together. And that's something writers like to do, play. So I can just see Don there and, starting a fire.
He was kind of disappointed when I finished writing the book. He said, "Are we going to blow any more stuff up or anything like that?" And now I surge into the lead as the worst parent of the year in your eyes, but we would, pour vodka onto the driveway and light it and experiment with. I wanted to make sure, that I had it right and, that we could actually do the things that I said we could do in the book.
The TNT at the end of the run, that was just part of the book, yeah.
He runs quickly for and much quicker since we started working on the book. Realizes the necessity of moving fast.
Poor kid gets a glazed look in his eye. Dad's bringing out matches again.
Oh God, Dad's doing research.
better do a fund right now for the future
Right.
for psychoanalysts.
Yeah. Ironically, our house sitter did set our house on fire. When I was actually down in La Jolla shooting a TV show, and when we get the call in our hotel, Adam called house fire, and he made up an outlandish story about how it started, and we pretended to believe it, but I did give him a copy of the book.
And you probably told your insurance company it was all research and they should pay this claim. Right?
Yeah, I did. The insurance guy came out, and I said, look, the story is obviously nonsense, but it was also as obviously an accident. Let's just, get it done. So.
Your last two novels, often when I talk about my last two novels, and people like the one-word synopsis, and I always say my last two novels, I said it's about the redemption of the character. Mm-hmm. And I'd say your last two novels, probably the one-word description would be appropriate for that. Would you, you seem to be emotionally invested in wanting your protagonist to make it out the other side of the tunnel. Is that what's driving your fiction these days?
Yeah, I think so. That's pretty perceptive. I'm usually much more shallow than that. So. I like to get into that kind of depth. The guy who did the screenplay for Bobby Z called me up and said, I want to take a certain scene out if you don't think it'll interrupt the religious structure of the book. No, I don't think so. I think it, it can hold up there pretty well without the actual crucifixion scene.
Yeah. I was about to make a line like that. I decided no, I didn't want to take it there.
I am interested in the redemption of people and people going through sort of a long, dark place and coming out on the other side, and so on a serious level.
Now your life changed with the feeding frenzy for Bobby C. What's the story about the picture now?
The feeding, the frenzy has subsided quite nicely. They were going to make it, an hour and a half after they bought it, and that was 5 years ago. And, it's amazing. To get a film made, you have to draw all these kite strings together at exactly the same moment, and that certainly hasn't happened. Right. So, but, they keep telling me it's like next year in Jerusalem. Every year they're going to make this movie. And
I hope you don't have to wait as long.
It's about on that schedule, And Moses, 40 years to make the movie, and I'll drop dead going to the premiere, Oh, there's the marquee, honey. But, they paid their money. I guess they can do what they want with it. Nothing apparently fits that category. So.
In your more recent fiction, your characters seem to be flying by the seat of their pants. I think people want to know, as the author, are you flying blind sometimes? Or do you
Most of the time.
Yep.
Most of the time. I used to do all these, elaborate outlines and 3-act structure, and I'd, stick to it. And then I discovered I didn't have to, so why should I, Bobby Z, I had no clue what was going to happen from one, train stop to the next, as it were. This book, I knew all too well what was going to happen, because I lived it, but I didn't know how to structure it in fictional terms. Mm-hmm. And I think I was still so angry about all of it that I was really fighting it a lot. No, I like to have some sort of structure, but I think, like everybody, you like to keep open the opportunity to surprise yourself, right. And then maybe surprise other people. And being basically lazy if the characters will do the work for me, and I'm happy to let that happen.
Right. Tough last question here, Don. George Bernard Shaw once said, "You must not suppose, because I'm a man of letters, that I never tried to earn an honest living." Whereas most of us had our salad days, you had your salad dressing days. Was that your worst job?
No, not even close. I was a mock terrorist for the State Department, and literally did. I still watch CNN sometimes, and I see somebody from the State Department. I say, "Oh, I kidnapped him," training exercise. He was a nice guy, or he was a jerk, or whatever. I literally did dig ditches. As a kid, under a beach house, which was very clever, because I was the smallest kid, so they'd put me through the top step to dig my way out. I think that was kind of the worst job I had. I've enjoyed everything that I've done, to tell you the truth. They've all had their kind of fun moments.
I had this vision of you in your cabin with 100 gallons of salad dressing sitting out in the back.
It wasn't salad dressing. No, I was in my cabin, and, I had the yellow manuscript pad and was trying to write the book that would eventually become my first book, Coolbreeze. But, yeah, it was fun. I saw a lot of little places, and it was good.
Okay, Jan Burk, you're on the spot now. I first met Jan Burk after I did a book signing in Venice Beach, and at that time I learned that Jan was soon to have her first book coming out with Simon & Schuster called Good Night, Irene. And just hearing that from someone is impressive, because generally big publishing houses, no matter how good the book is, they won't take on a first-time author. Usually a first-time author will get published through St. Martin's or Walker or paperback original. So Jan was playing big time from the onset. Over the years, our paths continue to cross at conventions and literary gatherings. And one thing I learned about Jan is that she has a passion for hockey that rivals any Canadians. Here's a woman who was born in Houston and grew up in Southern California, and her compass, for whatever reason, points north of the ice. I think Jan is that study in contradictions, because in person she's good-spirited and likes to laugh loud and often. And as you'll hear, her voice is on the high side. I don't doubt that when salespeople call her house, they still ask her if her mommy is in. And yet this woman with her youthful voice and laugh writes some of the toughest and most grisly scenes in crime fiction today. I think Jan should go on to tell the truth. My guess is that she'd stump the panel, and no one would picture her writing hard-boiled crime books. Several years ago at Left Coast Crime in Boulder, there was a so-called talent show among the mystery writers. And the guest of honor was Kinky Friedman, who, in addition to writing mysteries, is a well-known singer. Kinky had agreed to do a concert that night, and he was the act. But preceding him were these mystery writers who had agreed to show off their talents or lack thereof. I don't think any of the performers knew that the concert was scheduled in the downtown Boulder auditorium, and the tickets had actually been sold to the event. Now, it's bad enough making a fool of yourself in front of the mystery community, but mystery fans expect that. This was far worse. Instead of looking out an audience of 600 or 700 mystery fans, and you were looking out an audience with a lot of faces of people who actually expected to hear professional music. And in a weak moment, many months earlier, I had agreed to sing, but I knew that I was going to be accompanied by other people, and as well as a full band. So I figured I could sort of open my mouth and get away with it. Not so with Jan. I think she was the only solo performer that night, other than a comic who managed to miss every funny bone in the audience. If memory serves me, she was also the last act, the one that preceded Kinky. So Jan had to wait and wait and wait. And I know how nervous she was, because for much of that time I was backstage myself. Finally, the spotlight settled on Jan, and she sang Good Night, Irene. I don't think she missed a note, just as she doesn't miss notes when she writes her books. I was going to spring a request on her to have her sing a few bars, but instead I'll ask her a few questions. Sue Grafton's more than halfway through the alphabet, Jan, and all your 7 books have featured Irene Kelly, as evidenced by your recent Edgar, Bones. The series has never been better. How do you keep it not only alive but improving?
I'm convinced as I start each book that it's a terrible book and that I'm about to end my career with it. You just hope that you're stretching in some new direction, or I try to set the mark somewhere I haven't reached before and just hope for the best. The 8th book in the series, the one that will be out in March, is very different from the ones before it. It's all in third person, primarily from the point of view of Frank Harriman, who is Irene's husband, and begins with the section 10 years ago. This is the one thing I can't seem to get away from, is mixing history. The past always comes to haunt the present in the books, but other than that, it's quite different. And the passages, Irene is in the book, but the passages are featuring her from third person again. It's the first time I've ever written her in third person. So that keeps it new and different for me. Trying to go new places with the themes of the books does that. I'm not bored with it. I enjoy spending time with her and in that world. So, and as terrifying as it is, and even though it is work, as Abby and Don have talked about. Yeah.
When Jessica Fletcher was doing Murder, She Wrote, there was a joke going around that the most dangerous place in the world to live was Crabapple Cove. You talked about changing themes, and I noticed, is that the same? Is that one of the reasons that a lot of times the things are taking place outside of Las Pianas, that you can do a different territory, like in Bones?
Well, Bones begins in the mountains, and in earlier books, it's established that some bad things have happened to her in the mountains. So she doesn't especially enjoy being there, and I think that's the old Joseph Campbell hero model, where you have a hero that's asked to go reluctantly to meet that challenge. So for her, the mountains are really a hellish place, and she has to go there to, I think, not just encounter the particular demon of this book, but to
overcome
her own.
demons.
Yeah.
Research is obviously important to you. You took a seminar through AFIP, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, that helped you in the writing of Bones. Did you have the idea for the novel before the AFIP course, or did the light go off in your head while hearing all these forensic anthropologists talking?
Well, that sounds an awful like where do you get your ideas?
I think she was waiting for that one. Now, I said the audience couldn't ask that question. I didn't say I couldn't ask it.
Actually, I was sitting in that class, and I'd taken other courses and read other things about forensic anthropology before I was in the class. But during that course, which is a week-long course held in Washington, D.C., and it's attended by FBI agents and pathologists and medical examiners and people who are studying to become forensic anthropologists, and they have a really excellent staff. And one of the people who was teaching the course was talking about the section, this was in a section about how hidden remains, if a killer has hidden the remains of a victim, what are some of the ways, if a certain amount of time has passed, that you'd find these remains. And he mentioned the use of cadaver dogs, which are not dead dogs, but they're dogs that are trained to find remains. And he was talking about the remarkable ways in which they could be used to do this. And toward the end of this, he said, every so often they have to let the dogs find a living person, or the dogs become depressed. And you hear that little sound that went through the room, like I made that same sound, like, oh, and I'm thinking, wow, that's really something. Well, it turns out, after a lot of research, it's not true. But I think whenever I hear or I'm in a situation where something makes me react in that way, it tells me there's something about that worth pursuing, perhaps, for a novel. And so it gets on the short list. And I was really struck by the people who were teaching that course, who were so compassionate. They're volunteers. Forensic anthropologists are almost always volunteers. They're in really difficult working conditions. They face really horrifying results of all of this. Usually the bodies that they're dealing with are decayed. They're not in good shape. And they're usually the ones that the pathologists and medical examiners really just don't want to deal with. So they're quite often the last chance a victim has to be identified is the work of a forensic anthropologist, and the last chance for someone to discover what became of this person or what was done to this person. And it's often very depressing work for the individuals involved in it. But when you meet these people, what really struck me anyway was how compassionate they were, how much they felt for the victims and the families. And it was in such contrast to the people whose, their detection would lead to the capture of people who were utterly without compassion. And so that was a sort of natural set of opposites to bring together for the book.
You said before, every book you write you think is going to be terrible. Now, before you set on the journey of writing a book, are you passionate about the idea, or you think this might make a good idea for a novel, or what's going through your mind when you're saying, okay, this is the book I'm going to do?
Well, it's varied from book to book. Sometimes I start out really just like a house afire, I'm very excited about it. And other things maybe it's like falling in love, Sometimes it's right away, and other times it's just, you sit up one day and you go, this is going to work out after all, and I'm happy with. But I've realized over the years that you stay married to these things forever. There is no divorce in writing. You write the thing; it's part of your life from then on, and. They'll even find it out of print now on the internet. eBay will find you. You're going to have to live with that. So, yeah.
I've heard writers say that they treasure their villains more than their heroes. In my own writing, I think what's hardest for me to write is about my antagonist. I always have trouble coming to terms with their minds or their mindset or what they're doing. Mm-hmm. Tell us about some of your villains and how you try to shape them.
I think in a mystery there are three people that are characters that are very important. Obviously, the protagonist is very important. The antagonist is also very important. I think if you don't have an interesting villain, again, there's nothing for the protagonist to push against. There's why fight this fight if this person isn't worth fighting or going after? So I hope that's something I've become better at. I hope I've become better at doing villains stuff. Certainly Nick Parrish creeped the heck out of me. I didn't like living with him through the writing of Bones at all. I felt the same way about the villain in Flight. That I just really disliked writing about him and disliked him and felt very creepy whenever he was sort of on the page.
Sounds like you don't love your villains very much.
But I think that that third sort of character that's important is the victim, and I think a lot of times in certain styles of mystery, especially, they get overlooked.
The short shrift, I agree.
And so yeah, all three are important to me.
Last question for you. K.C. Constantine once wrote that he started writing crime fiction because he'd had no success in selling anything else. Mm-hmm. Why did you start writing crime fiction?
Loved them. Loved mysteries. I've always loved reading them. I didn't read Nancy Drew. I confess that now. I think I read one Nancy Drew book when I was in junior high or something, and it really didn't capture my attention. But in high school, I started reading Agatha Christie. I have to say my love of the genre came in college with Chandler and Hammett, reading the hard-boiled writers. Cornell Woolrich, somebody nobody remembers anymore, also wrote as William Irish. If you've ever seen the Hitchcock film Rear Window, that was based on one of his books. Really lousy at plot, but he just could scare the heck out of you. There'd be this big hole and everything depended on coincidence, but he could create a mood that would just make all your nails very short by the end of the book, make the everyday events totally terrifying. So I enjoyed reading his work as well, and it was a very natural thing. I think I heard this piece of advice a long time ago that you should write the book you want to read, and I think there's something to that. And I was reading a lot of books in which, going back to the victim, a lot of people were dying. There was just no grief on the part of the protagonist, who was supposed to become personally involved in this thing, but they weren't feeling anything but something like a desire for revenge. So it was a chance to write a book I wanted to read.
Thanks. Last panelist here, Michael Connelly.
Just remember, I know who you are.
I first met Michael in 1992. My second book, The Forest Primeval, was published about the same time as first novel, The Black Echo. And as is the case with two unknown authors, we were scheduled to sign together at a bookstore in Scottsdale. And I remember the bookseller called me, and being the veteran, she asked me if I'd mind signing with a young pup named Michael Connelly. When booksellers do this pairing, it sometimes is an odd couple kind of situation. But I was enthusiastic about the event because I had already read Michael's first book, and I thought it was terrific. Apparently, I wasn't alone in that opinion, as the book did go on to win the Edgar for the best first novel. Back when Michael was a rookie, he was very shy, and he actually welcomed the idea of us talking together because it alleviated his stage fright. The world of publishing and being an author was still new to him, and he was getting his sea legs. When we first met, I was a hotel manager, and Mike was working for the LA Times. And despite being at the top of our profession, so to speak, both of us had this desperate need to want to write full-time and leave our jobs. And as it turned out, years later, we both quit our jobs within 3 weeks of each other. There are some writers whose success puzzles me. They don't write well, and their ideas aren't original. But, from the first, I was convinced that Michael would make it big as a writer. He had all the tools, and as time passed, he proved me right. You know, I was glad of his success because sometimes it's really nice to see that nice guys do finish first. It didn't happen overnight for Mike. For a time, our books always seemed to come out at the same time, so we made a point of trying to arrange signings together. And there was one particular bookstore that we did 3 times together. Now, this bookstore no longer exists, and there's a reason for that. No one went there, and going in, Mike and I would always know no one was going to show up, and we weren't going to sell any books, but it seemed like a really good excuse for us to drink some beers and just, talk. I'm afraid that Mike can't do that anymore. The last time I went to see him at a signing, his line extended down the block. One thing that hasn't changed about Mike is that even with all success, he's the same person he was in 1992. Instead of getting a swelled head, he still feels incredibly lucky to be doing what he loves. Years ago, Ken Culkin, who's another mystery writer, and I had a book coming out at the same time, and we met up with Michael in Seattle, and the 3 of us did a signing together. Now, because Mike was getting hot then, if memory serves me, I think he would just hit the bestseller list for the first time in paperback. His publisher had set him up at a very nice hotel. And as I remember it, I don't think our publishers were even springing for a Motel 6. So instead of pretending he didn't know us, which probably would have been the smart thing to do, Michael invited Ken and I to share his quarters. And I don't know too many best-selling authors who would willingly open the gates to Visigoths, but he did. Because Michael sometimes speaks so softly, people don't catch his one-liners, and I've learned to listen for them. Mike and I are the same age. And 4 years ago, I decided to celebrate my 40th birthday with a little party on the ocean at Laguna Beach. And Ken Culkin also attended the party, but he left early because the next morning he had to be in Tijuana to see Mother Teresa. So someone asked Ken why he was going to see Mother Teresa, and I heard Michael mutter in his soft voice, he's going to try to get her to blurb his book. Those are the kind of things he says. You really have to listen for him. Speaking of blurbs, Michael was kind enough to blurb one of my books, Multiple Wounds, and he liked the book a lot, and so much that he even has protagonists reading it in one section of his book, The Poet. I was quite honored by that. In another of his books, Trunk Music, he had a cameo appearance by detectives Russell and Culkin. And I decided I should return Michael's literary favors, and at the same time, knowing what a good sense of humor he has, I figured I'd up the ante. So in my book, Shame, there's a very interesting character named Michelle Connelly. I won't say anything more, except that I'm still waiting for Michael's revenge. Right now, Michael's just coming up for air because for the last 18 months he's worked on his baby, a television show called Level 9. It made its debut last week, and it might not be something you want to talk about, Mike, but tell us about that TV show. And also, I'd appreciate you telling the audience about that wonderful writing advice that producer gave you, that network executive gave you.
Actually, 18 months is probably too much. It wasn't like 18 months of my life because I actually wrote a book during the 18 months. But it was an idea that began 18 months ago, and working with network people and studio people and that whole world, which was alien to me, has been an interesting year and a half. The show finally aired 2 Fridays ago. The second episode was on last night, and it's unlikely you'll be able to see it if you didn't see it, because the ratings plummeted last night. So it's not long for this world. But it was an interesting time. I think as storytellers, you should explore all kinds of things. Anything that's open to you, try it, see if you like it. And probably the whole 18 months was a valuable lesson in telling me that I should go back to writing books and kind of embrace that world. Now, as far as the studio exec, I mean, I got so much good advice from these people, it's hard for me to remember.
Well, before that, now whenever I'm sure anyone gets invited over his house, instead of showing home movies, he'll be showing Level 9, the episode 1 and 2. But you mentioned how he told you.
Oh, there is, the process is you have your idea, you sell it to these people by committee, and then they commission a script, and so I had a partner on this, and we made that leap, and we got a network to say, yeah, write us a script, and we got some. Before we even started writing, really, we started getting notes and messages and helpful hints from these people. And one guy said, make sure. I'm trying to remember exactly what he said. He said, try not to give everything away in the beginning of the script, because people kind of like to have things tied up at the end. And I thanked him, and well, the story goes that I thanked him and I said, that's helpful. You mind if I use that when I write my books? And the guy said, well, I don't read books, but if it works for you, use it.
Last week you mentioned you'd finished your 10th novel, which is Milestone Event. And in preparation for writing that novel, you went back and read your first 9 novels. What did you discover?
I don't really. It's like Don said, he hasn't read one of the California book. I don't really like to read my books again. It's the process is so you're rewriting constantly, and you live with the story for so long that by the time, at least in my experiences, by the time I'm done a book, I really have lost sight of it, and I'm just hoping that it's good or it's up to the standards I set at the beginning of the writing period. So it's not good for me to read my books. On occasions I have read parts of books, but I don't think I've completely reread one of my books once it was actually a book, once it was out of a manuscript. And my 10th book, I was going to have characters from all the standalones and with Harry Bosch and different characters from all the books, so I wanted to, so it was going to be a summing up of all my books. So I felt I should read them all to make sure I have details right, so I could take notes, because I never did that along the road, which I probably should have done. And it was an interesting process to read these books, and I could see my growth as a writer definitely, and I kind of felt. I guess the conclusion that I came to was that. I didn't know this at the time, but I think I was writing mostly about stuff that really scared me. And, the adage about writers is write what you know, and everyone does that, but that kind of cloaks what I think they're doing, or at least what I was doing. I was writing about things that really scare me, even maybe in a subliminal way or subconscious way, but it really kind of came back to me as almost being obvious when I would read a book I had written 5 years before, so.
Goethe once said, know thyself, if I knew myself, I'd run away.
What's with all these quotes?
Read my books and you'll read these quotes in them too. One of the things you said you didn't like about TV writing is that it didn't allow for any introspection on the page. When you write your books, your characters seem to live to you. Are you thinking visually?
You know what? I don't know. I mean, the writing process is very mysterious. I mean, do I sit there really and consciously say I want this to be very visual? No. I just I try to write as fast as I can. I just think the less I concentrate or less time I spend on a sentence, the better the sentence will be. And I think that just makes it visual. So I'm kind of like a cut and run writer. I just keep going, and then when I'm done a whole draft, I come back and see what I've got. And you come back, because it will take you several weeks or months to get a draft done. When you come back to go through it again, you really have a fresh look at stuff. And at that, with my experience, is that I know this is awful or this is really good. And I don't mean like the whole book, but I mean sections. I can tell where I really had the vibe, and sections where I didn't. And then I'd go through that draft really fast too.
Ever since he worked for Hollywood, he started using words like vibe.
I almost said mojo. So.
I once asked you if the Black Echo had been rejected by any houses, and you told me that it had been rejected by a number. And although you've experienced great success with your writing, I don't sense that it's really gotten any easier for you. Along the way, sometimes you tell me about your travails and how you still slug it out with characters and plots to make all of us feel better. Tell us about some of your worst experiences.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I've had some bad experiences where essentially I don't outline books. I did in the very beginning of my career, so I would advise new writers to do that so you can kind of learn how to construct a book. But 2 or 3 books in, I stopped outlining, and that is a more pleasurable way to write. It is a speedier way, which I was just talking about. It facilitates that better. But it's also the dangerous way to write because you can just start going down the wrong way and not realize it for many, many pages. And so I've had experiences where I've thrown out as many as 340 manuscript pages because of a wrong turn I made. And those are obviously sleepless nights when you're making that decision. But even that, I mean, once I made, like the 340 thing, that was in my book Bloodwork. So I had written a completely different book from what eventually came out. And so when I look back on that, I'm very happy and proud that I was able to bite the bullet and make that kind of decision. But, individual bad times, they don't really stand out to me. I find that this process of writing these books gets harder with each book. It's kind of like one of your numerous quotes, that one about who cares who killed Roger Ackroyd. I'm actually I kind of feel like that. I don't really, in my books, I don't really care who killed. I mean, I care, but it's like about 4th or 5th down the list who did it and why. What I care about most is about the guy who's trying to find who killed Roger Ackroyd and what makes that person tick and what it's like to go into that darkness as a job and what happens when the darkness rubs off on you. And to keep doing that, and with a series, with my Harry Bosch series, and keep going into that and trying to find something new about this character and new to say about him is very difficult. Each year I try to do it.
An old writing axiom is that the wastebasket should be a writer's best friend. So when you threw out those 340 pages, I know how tough that was. And you were talking about, that's what I was thinking. I know in that book, when you threw out the 340 pages, we were both struggling, and you had a scientist originally, and it was, yeah, so people who are struggling with the novel, everyone here still struggles with novels. It goes on.
I think if you think if you're writing and you're thinking, hey, this is a breeze, there's something tragically wrong and you don't know.
You're probably typing and not writing is what's going on. I thought it was funny that Mike said, he has a beautiful office now and ocean view, but the first thing he did was he put blinds up in the office. And that's how I write. I lived in Del Mar for a time, and I hated being so close to the ocean and, all the sights there. I want to look at a blank wall. I don't want any scenery. All writers have the ambition to be read long after they're gone, Mike. So how do you try to set the bar higher, and what challenges do you put yourself to try to improve? And how do you, try to make a better book these days?
I don't know, because there's that mysterious thing. First of all, the part about, all writers want to be read afterwards, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I'm like, Raymond Chandler said about the big sleep, when you're dead, you're dead. So I don't really care about that. And like Jan said, I try to each time write the book I would want to read. And so I think I'm a more sophisticated reader, especially in this genre, having written several books now. So that automatically raises the bar. For me to write the book that I want to read, it's got to be better than The Black Echo or Bloodwork or whatever. And so you just kind of automatically, all of us here, just continue to demand more of ourselves. And we're always our strongest critic. It's really hard to take bad reviews and all that stuff, but nothing is worse than your own, in your brain, what you really think of what you've written. And that's the toughest thing to take. And so if you don't want to hear in your brain saying this is not that good, you just dig deeper and try harder.
I think we all use more profanity than that when we're thinking we don't want to make it a piece of garbage or something. Last question for you, Mike. Harry Bosch has been your series characters. Have you thought about taking any of your characters from your standalone books and running with them further?
Yeah, I mean, I think all my characters are all moving on the same planes. I think the stories are all interlocked, and I have no qualms about like taking one character from a standalone and sticking him in the other. And in this book I have coming out in January, it seems like everybody's in it. All the books are, at least there's references to all the books, or all the characters are connected, and it's an interesting canvas to work with. I mean, I've written, I think it's 6 or 7 with Harry Bosch, and in this next book, I take a character that was in Bloodwork and use him to look at Harry Bosch. So this book would be, I think, will be considered a Harry Bosch, but you're not as much inside Harry's brain and looking at the world through his eyes. You're looking at Harry's world through someone else's eyes, and so over time, when you build up enough of these books, you have a lot of freedom to do those type of things.
We're going to the round robin part of our forum here, and I'll be throwing some questions out. People on the panel can answer or not answer as they see fit. Just for Mike, I have a quote here. William Faulkner once admitted, and I quote, "I tried to tell it again, the same story through the eyes of another brother. That was still not it. I told it for the third time through the eyes of the third brother. That was still not it. I tried to gather the pieces together and fill in the gaps by making myself the spokesman. It was still not complete. I never could tell it right, though I tried hard, and I would like to try again, though I'd probably fail again." Question, everyone here,
Whatever.
is, just go ahead and run with that, Mike. Have any books ever defeated anyone here on the panel? But the more important question is, how did the panel succeed in birthing a book that didn't want to be born? No one.
I've thrown away, I shouldn't say thrown away. I've set aside an entire manuscript. Goodnight, Irene was my first attempt to write a novel, and that got published, but that doesn't mean that somewhere along the line I didn't write something that I just was not pleased with. So I had an entire manuscript, a whole story, and I looked at the thing when it was done, and it just wasn't something I wanted to publicly attach my name to.
So you wrote it under Michelle Connelly
This is
pseudonym.
again like cleaning up what I actually thought of it. But I also think that I learned something about my craft by doing that, and I don't think that was a waste of my time by any means. I learned something from that. I learned some very important things from that. Like I didn't want to go through that again, and I may again. I don't know. But I've also cannibalized the parts of it I did like. I'll never be able to publish it now because people say, "Well, she's just patched together these other things and made it into this book," but it's actually the other way around. And who knows? Maybe one day I'll be, sitting on a beach somewhere, and it'll suddenly occur to me how I could make that story work, but it wasn't going to. So I have done that, and it's, again, I think that's something a writer has to be prepared to do. If you're only thinking in terms of publication, I think you're going to be bitterly disappointed, no matter how successful you are. I don't think you're going to get what you really need out of it. So.
Any other 2 cents here on that one? No?
Well, I would just reiterate what you said. Nothing, if there's people that are writers here, nothing is ever wasted. You learn from everything, and so we all probably have stuff in our drawers that we'd be embarrassed by, but we're not embarrassed by the effort or what we learned from that process.
Bob Wade, who couldn't be here, said he approached writing like a 9-to-5 job. He went to his office, sat at his desk, and worked. What are your routines?
I treat it like a factory job. I do. I came from, the Northeast, where people worked in factories, and came from a blue-collar background. And I try to be at my desk by 6:30 every morning, like, the bell rings. And I'm one of those people, I thank God every morning that I'm allowed to do this for a living. And so I don't want to abuse that, and so, the bell rings, I'm there. The bell rings, I go to lunch, The bell rings, I come back. And I know that sounds pedestrian and maybe not sort of artsy or not terribly creative, but that's the way I do it. I just sit there, and some days are good.
But setting fires is more fun, isn't it?
It's a lot more fun, you kidding? Nothing like that. But so, pretty colors, it's exciting. But yeah, I agree with that. That's the way I approach it. And unless I'm in a real crisis, I take weekends off.
Abby, your 9 to 5 is 9 p.m. to 5 a.m.,
Yeah,
isn't
I
it?
was really embarrassed sitting here. I too am from a very conservative background, Southern Indiana. It has to do with God in the minds of folks there. I mean, if you don't get up by 7 o'clock in the morning, there's something about you that is visibly morally flawed. And I grew up with this, and I was so glad to get away from it. But I'm still embarrassed because I am morally flawed in this regard. I'm a night person, and I just can't abide morning in any form. And the idea of writing in the morning is a joke for me. I couldn't. I mean, if for $1 million a minute, I could not do it. I could turn on the computer and fake it, and I have been known to do this. When the deadline is drawing near and I want whoever happens to be God probably watching to think that I'm writing, I'll go in there and turn it on. And sometimes even play solitaire, or even, maybe send an email or two. But as far as, the real thing, the really, really deep, meaningful thing when you really get into the trance and start writing, it happens for me at 3 p.m. and not 1 second before.
Any other...
I'm also a night owl. Abby already knows that. Years ago, we wrote something called the Night Owl Manifesto for an organization we were in. They kept holding breakfast meetings. But no, I write late at night. I don't know if that... I used to think that might have happened because I was writing after work and just got into that. But the truth is, I've always been a night person, and that's just when there are fewer distractions for me. Procrastination and research, is my favorite form of procrastination. It's harder to do late at night. I pretty much have to write. But once I'm going, I will write. It's really basically I write. I sort of stumble into the kitchen and make something to eat, go back and just keep writing. I'll work for very long hours. When it's really going, I don't like to do anything but that pretty much. So I'll get very little sleep during that period of time, and I don't leave a very healthy lifestyle, but I don't know how to say it except that I go into that world and stay there as long as possible. So.
Yeah, I think we all have this in common, and almost every writer I know, is that you definitely have to set a work ethic and stick with it, and that gets you into a routine that I think is really important. I remember I mentioned I remember reading that Michael Crichton's routine was so exacting that he eats the same thing for lunch every single day when he's writing a book, and it was like eating tuna fish sandwiches day after day after day because he didn't want to get knocked out of his vibe. And so I read that and thought, well, I hate tuna fish sandwich, but this guy writes, he sells a lot of books. I'm going to try that. The food part didn't last, but the setting the hours and everything has always worked for me.
The tuna fish bestseller. Now, I once heard Sue Grafton say that she dresses up before going writing. She puts on her makeup. She acts like she's going to the office. I mean, I'm lucky if a razor blade comes within 10 feet of my face, and I, stagger over to the chair. And I mean, any of you take it to that extreme that you dress up for writing?
The makeup thing I've left out.
Ah, that old vaudevillian. What about you, Mike? The makeup to live out too? Or?
Yeah. No, I was, when I was writing today, I was dressed like you and Don, but then I put on a Hawaiian shirt to come here.
I think there's something to it. You know, I'll come across as the group's fascist. I think there's something to it. To me, you know, some days I'll get up and, you know, as they'll testify to, I won't shave and I'll have the sweats on because I work at home. You know, I go into another part of the house. But most of the time, yeah, I shave and I kind of put some real clothes on, and I think it's my job, you know. So yeah, I don't dress like this.
It's that
but I
Catholic
do.
school education again.
Yes. It is.
Maybe it's a night owl thing, but, you know, I realize that it's time for me to kind of like get outside a little when, if my dog gets excited because I've put on a bra. Hey, we're going somewhere.
I don't think that would have qualified for Sue. How do you segue from that? Some uplifting remark. I have certain rules that work for my own writing. One of them is that I try to go 100 pages, sort of dovetails with what Mike said, before I allow myself to go back and do massive editing. That allows me to get a block of work done without going crazy knowing it's not right. Are there any rules you live by that you might want to impart to the audience? No?
No, well, I mean, you know, there's writing where you're actually writing and writing when you're not, and you're putting the story together in your head and so forth. I like that part better than actually sitting down at the computer. But once I get to the level where I'm sitting at the computer, I feel like I have to write every day. Even if I can only get to the computer for a half hour, I do it. So that's really the only lasting rule I think I have.
I have two of them. One is a professor taught me never waste 10 minutes, sort of similar, you know. So if there's that 10 minutes where nothing else is going on, I will go and I'll try to write, if it's a sentence or two, you know, I'll do that. The second, which is much more important, is always give your characters, the recurring ones, very short names. So, you know.
Ed.
That's it. No apostrophe, nothing, just bam, you know.
I wish I'd thought of that before I named my character's dog Bronte, because you have to put those two little dots over the E every time, and that entails going through this morbid sequence of events. This is good advice.
You know, I wonder why every one of Don's books, main protagonist was Ed. You know,
I just wanted to let everyone know that there's this thing in Word called auto text, and I've like assigned a key for one of my protagonists' name. I actually found out I couldn't say the guy's name, but it was Lefebvre, and it's this French name, and it's so easy to mess up the consonants. So he was just, you know, when I actually have had to like write the guy's name out, I have to really think hard about it, because right now he's just a button up on the
Just a button.
on the toolbar.
You can sing that
Right.
too.
in the future, when she talks about this character, she'll probably reach out with a finger and versus since Mike likes quotations so much, I was curious as to whether you had any favorite quotations from other people's books or your own book, or, you know, preferably, can you think of a line that you liked in one of your books that you can say, yeah, I wrote that line. I'm pleased I wrote that line. Not a one, huh, Mike?
No.
Anyone?
I can't think of any offhand. One quote that goes back to the writing process is Kurt Vonnegut once said, make sure on every page everybody wants something. And that would be like my second rule after the write every day. No, his quote was, make sure on every page everybody wants something, even if it's just a glass of water. I mean, it's 'cause what he means is through wants and conflict is how you delineate character. And that was probably like a little throwaway line from him, but it's like my life revolves around it now.
Speaking of a glass of water, we will break shortly, but just curious, any quotations there that your own or someone else's?
My favorite is still Somerset Maugham's, which was that there are 3 rules for writing. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. And I find, I mean, one of the interesting things for me just is, you know, Don works in the morning in a suit, and we won't go into what I'm wearing, but I think that there are different things work. The main thing is that you have to do the work. I talked to a lot of people at a lot of writing conferences, and an awful lot of them apparently want to go into the stationery business because they're not putting anything on those blank pieces of paper. And that's what it really comes down to. Until you're putting something on the page, you're not there. And you're not going to get there any other way. I wish it were easier. God knows. I wish that, I could just wish it into existence somehow. But you have to do that work.
Mine is from Winston Churchill. Never, 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 never give up.
Can you top that?
Actually, I can't. I have no favorite quotation. Actually, I have a favorite quotation. It doesn't have anything to do with writing.
That's okay.
Tell us.
I was throwing it out for anything.
Okay, be a lonely ghost uttering a truth nobody will ever hear, because it is not by making yourself heard, but by staying sane that you carry out the human heritage. That's George Orwell. I used to have that written in nail polish on the dashboard of my first car.
There we go.
Is that the car you gave that sailor a ride in?
And he was a little worried because he couldn't open the door. He kept looking at the quote and trying to open the door. I'd like to thank everyone for coming here tonight. Please be aware that all the authors will be going out to the lobby now, where we'll be glad to answer your questions and deface your books. Now it's time for Don to lead everybody out in a rumble line, and Jan to sing Goodnight, Irene. Thank you again for coming.